Her daughter-in-law slapped her, then warned her to keep quiet. Helen Ford, retired paralegal and widow, said nothing. By the next sunrise, Carla's name was erased from the joint accounts, the medical directives, and the trust Helen had once built for family. She'd spent 2 years documenting every slight, every lie, every misstep. Now, when they tried to seize control of her life, the paperwork would do what she never raised her voice to say. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The scent of sizzling steak crept down the hallway before Helen even reached the kitchen. It was the kind of smell that used to mean family, Sunday dinners, laughter, and her late husband humming off-key near the stove. Now it only meant she was about to be reminded that she no longer belonged in her own son's home. From the archway, she watched Carla at the range, tongs in hand, turning strips of meat that glistened in a shallow cast-iron pan. The golden retriever, Bentley, sat at her feet, tail brushing the tile, head tilted in devotion. Helen waited for a natural pause, but Carla never looked up. "Smells good," Helen said quietly, polite as habit. "Should I set another plate?" Without turning, Carla said, "There's cereal in the cabinet." The tone wasn't cruel by volume, only by precision. Each word sliced thin, practiced. Helen stood still. The overhead light flickered once, its hum filling the silence that followed. Mark stepped in from the garage, his tie loosened, his eyes already weary. He took in the tension like someone stepping into a cold lake, one cautious inch, then retreat. "I'll check the mail," he muttered, and disappeared back the way he came. The steak hissed as Carla laid another piece in the pan. She finally turned, meeting Helen's eyes over the rising steam. "Honestly," she said, voice syrup sweet, "I'd feed the dog before I feed you." Helen's hands didn't move. Not a twitch. Years of paralegal work had trained her to hold still when someone wanted a reaction. Her gaze drifted instead to the countertop, polished quartz, spotless except for a single porcelain bowl already waiting beside the stove. It was Bentley's bowl, his name engraved in gold. Carla slid the steak from the pan with deliberate care, sliced it into neat pieces, and tipped them into the bowl. Bentley wagged once and began to eat, oblivious. The sound of the dog's chewing filled the room. Helen looked down at her reflection in the countertop. Gray hair cropped neatly, lavender sweater buttoned high, a woman who had done everything right for 70 years and somehow ended up begging for dinner. She stepped back from the kitchen doorway, one slow movement at a time, like someone easing away from an animal you can't quite trust. The hallway seemed longer tonight, the light colder. Her pulse beat behind her ears, but her breathing stayed even, controlled. In her room, she sat on the edge of the guest bed, the one Carla had dressed in decorative pillows and nothing else. A bowl of cereal waited on the dresser, untouched from breakfast. Helen picked up the spoon, set it back down. From downstairs came Carla's laughter, followed by the sound of a television turning on. Helen could picture it easily. Carla curled on the couch, wine in hand, dog at her feet, Mark quiet beside her like an accessory. Helen reached for the notebook in her nightstand. A simple black ledger, nothing fancy. On the first empty line, she wrote in sharp, even script, 6:42 p.m., steak prepared for Bentley. "There's cereal in the cabinet." She underlined the time twice. The ritual steadied her. Every fact recorded, every insult archived. Facts had power. She'd learned that across decades of drafting contracts, reading depositions, and watching liars crumble when paper spoke louder than words. A low whine drifted through the vent. Bentley, probably begging for seconds. Helen smiled faintly. "Enjoy it, sweetheart," she whispered to the empty room. "You're the only one she's kind to." She stood, brushed imaginary crumbs from her slacks. and straightened the lavender sweater that now smelled faintly of cooked meat and lavender detergent. Her reflection in the window looked steady. Older, yes, but not fragile. In the quiet, she heard Carla's voice again, distant. "Mark, your mother's so sensitive lately." Helen's fingers tightened around the notebook. The page fluttered in the small draft from the vent. She closed it, slipped it back into the drawer, and turned off the lamp. Tomorrow she would start packing her things into boxes labeled with neat handwriting, just in case. Downstairs, Bentley barked once, sharp, insistent. A fork clinked against a plate. Helen stared into the dark and let the words echo one more time. "I'd feed the dog before I feed you." Her jaw set. "We'll see," she murmured. The morning after the steak, the house smelled of coffee and lemon cleaner. Carla was already moving briskly through the kitchen, her heels clicking against the tile like small, sharp verdicts. Helen stayed quiet at the table, a cup of lukewarm coffee before her, notebook closed beside it. She'd slept little, listening to the rhythmic hum of the refrigerator, rehearsing silence. When Carla turned, the movement was so sudden it startled the dog. "I found your little list," she said, voice tight. "All your notes. What are you planning to do with them?" Helen looked up, calm. "They're mine. I write things down so I don't forget." Carla's smile was paper thin. "You don't get to take notes on me in my house." "It's my son's house, too," Helen said evenly. Carla stepped closer, the air between them turning dense. "Don't test me, Helen. You think writing down times and dates makes you important? It makes you pathetic." Helen pushed back her chair slowly. "I think it makes me precise." The silence that followed was taut enough to hum. Then, in a flash of motion, so quick even Bentley startled, Carla's hand struck across Helen's cheek. A sharp, hollow sound. Helen didn't cry out. She just blinked once. The pain came after. The heat blooming across her skin, the metallic taste of shock settling in her mouth. Carla froze, her chest rising fast. For one long second, neither woman moved. Then Carla's voice came low, a whisper meant to wound. "Tell anyone, and I'll say you hit me first." Helen's eyes stayed fixed on hers. Steady, clear, unblinking. "I believe you would," she said quietly. Carla's jaw clenched. "Don't forget who people will believe." She turned and walked out, heels snapping like punctuation marks on the tile. Helen stood still until the sound of the garage door swallowed the quiet. Then she let her breath out slowly, one controlled exhale. Her cheek throbbed. She touched it lightly, felt the warmth spreading, the outline of Carla's palm faint but sure. She walked to her room, closed the door, and opened her drawer. The notebook waited, black and neat as always. She flipped to the next line and wrote, hand steady. 8:19 a.m. Struck across left cheek. Verbal threat of false accusation. She paused, then underlined the word threat twice. The mirror above the dresser showed the mark deepening from pink to red. For the first time in months, Helen didn't bother with concealer or her light scarf. Let them see. Let them guess. By noon, she was at the Kroger on East Main, list in hand, milk, apples, crackers. The automatic doors opened with a hush of air. Fluorescent lights buzzed faintly. Her reflection followed her in the freezer doors, the bruise standing out like punctuation at the end of a sentence she hadn't finished. She didn't need to wait long. Near the produce section, a familiar voice said, "Helen Ford? Lord, it's been ages." Tessa Kane, sharp bob of hair, denim jacket, eyes that saw everything and missed nothing. She stopped short when she noticed Helen's cheek. "What on earth happened to you?" Helen gave the smallest shrug. "Kitchen accident." Tessa tilted her head. "You were married to an attorney for 40 years, worked for 2 more, and you think I can't spot a lie?" Helen looked down at her cart. 3 apples, 1 gallon of milk, and a box of cereal. the same one Carla had pointed at. Tessa folded her arms. Tell me you're not letting her win. The words hit something raw, something that had been sitting silent under Helen's skin since last night. She didn't answer, but the tremor in her hands stilled. Tessa leaned closer, voice low but fierce. You still have friends who know how to use paper better than she does. Don't you forget that? Helen met her eyes. I don't forget anything, she said softly. Outside, the wind lifted as the automatic doors opened again, scattering a few receipts across the parking lot. Helen stepped into the chill air, her cheek aching, her notebook waiting in the passenger seat of her car. She turned the key, engine humming to life, and glanced once in the rearview mirror at her reflection, the bruise stark, undeniable. The house smelled like a showroom, candle wax, roasted garlic, and something floral meant to disguise tension. By 6 o'clock, voices filled the rooms. Carla floated between them like a hostess from a glossy magazine spread, all charm and teeth. The kind of woman who laughed just a little too loudly when she wanted to prove everything was perfect. Helen lingered in the doorway of the living room, watching guests set their wine glasses on coasters embossed with gold monograms. The furniture gleamed. Even Bentley had a fresh haircut and bow tie. Mom, Mark said softly from across the room, voice carrying the strain of a man forever walking a tightrope. You can sit there, if you want. He gestured to a narrow bench tucked near the hallway, half in shadow, between the shoe rack and a decorative plant. No plate, no silverware, not even a napkin. Helen gave a small nod and sat anyway. She folded her hands neatly in her lap. The table, bright under the chandelier, gleamed with 12 place settings of white porcelain and crystal. One for each of Carla's friends from work and their husbands, their laughter mixed with the clinking of glasses. Carla brushed past her once, all perfume and silk. Don't get up, Helen, she said, the tone sugared and precise. We've got plenty covered. Helen smiled faintly. I can see that. Bentley patted over, resting his chin on her knee for a moment before being called away by a whistle and a scrap of steak. The irony wasn't lost on her. The evening blurred into polished anecdotes and orchestrated laughter. Carla dominated the conversation. Stories about promotions, interior design trends, a Pilates instructor who was basically a genius. Helen watched Mark nod at all the right places, eyes dull, fingers tracing the rim of his wineglass as if afraid of what silence might invite. When the first round of dinner plates arrived, Helen's stomach knotted. She caught Carla's eye briefly, a polite, silent question. Carla's answer was a smirk, barely perceptible to anyone else. Halfway through the meal, Helen stood, murmured something about a headache, and walked quietly down the hall. No one stopped her. In her room, the overhead light was softer, warmer. She sat on the edge of her bed, opened the drawer, and pulled out a sleeve of crackers. Each bite was slow, deliberate, tiny, dry protests against humiliation. Through the vent, she could hear Carla's laughter again. Then, words, carried faintly through the metal. We don't need her scaring the guests with those wrinkles. A round of laughter followed. Mark didn't speak. Helen chewed one last cracker, swallowed hard, and stared at the wall. The old ache of being invisible pressed at her chest, but beneath it was something steadier. A pulse, a focus. Facts, not feelings. She reached for her notebook. She wrote 8:03 p.m. Dinner party. No seat, no setting. Insult overheard through vent. She didn't underline anything this time. She didn't need to. Her phone buzzed, Tessa's name lighting the screen. Saw your car home early. Everything okay? Helen typed back. Fine. Just tired. Seconds later, liar. Want me to bring pie or a plan? Helen stared at the words, then smiled despite herself. She typed, maybe both. Later that night, after the last guests left and the clatter of dishes faded, a new message arrived from Tessa with an attachment. A draft email template titled, "To Attorney Maddox." Helen opened it, reading the simple subject line, "Need to discuss family law." She sat there, hands poised over the keyboard. For years, she'd helped others compose letters that changed their lives, petitions, contracts, statements of fact. Now it was her turn. She typed her name at the bottom and clicked send. The whoosh of the email leaving her outbox was small but final, like a door closing softly behind her. The attorney's office smelled faintly of paper and peppermint, the kind of scent that promised order. Helen sat across from Ray Maddox at a walnut desk polished to a mirror shine, the morning light from Broad Street slanting through the blinds in even stripes. He studied her with a lawyer's patience. "Tessa said you wanted to talk about some family matters," he said. His voice was low, practiced, neutral, the kind of tone that made people confess more than they planned to. Helen opened her folder. Everything inside was labeled, dated, and clipped neatly, decades of paralegal discipline distilled into perfect tabs. "I'm not being taken care of," she said quietly, "and I don't mean health-wise. I mean financially, legally, and—" She hesitated. Respectfully. Ray leaned forward, elbows on the desk. "Tell me what's happening, Mrs. Ford." "Call me Helen." He nodded once. She spread the pages across the desk. Retirement accounts, investment summaries, pension statements, and the title to the Craftsman house she'd sold 2 years ago. "I have $620,000, she said simply. "Not a fortune, but enough. It's mine. I want it somewhere safe." Ray's eyes moved over the numbers, calculating silently. "Safe from whom?" "My son's wife," Helen said. The words landed without tremor. "And from him, if I'm honest." Something flickered in Ray's face. Recognition, maybe. He'd seen this before. The quiet erosion of dignity inside families that smiled in Christmas cards. "You came to the right place," he said finally. "It's time to move it where they can't touch it." He pulled a fresh legal pad closer. The scratch of his pen was crisp, deliberate. "We'll set up a living trust," he continued, "with you as primary trustee. I recommend naming a secondary who you trust absolutely. Someone who won't fold under pressure." Helen smiled faintly. "I already have someone in mind." 2 hours later, Tessa sat in the same chair, reading the draft trust agreement as though it were a recipe. "You sure you want me in this?" she asked. "This kind of power could go to my head." Helen's lips curved slightly. "It already has." Ray slid the documents across the table. "Sign here and here." The pen felt cool against Helen's fingers as she pressed her signature onto the paper. Her handwriting was small and decisive. No hesitation, no wasted motion. When the last page was signed, Ray handed her a crisp folder with embossed lettering. "Everything in here overrides any existing financial powers of attorney. You'll also want to remove your son as your medical POA. That's an easy amendment." Helen's brows lifted. "Let's do it today." The printer hummed to life, spitting out new forms. The rhythmic sound reminded her of her old office. Order in motion, justice in ink. As Ray stapled the final pages, he said, "You're remarkably composed. You know that?" Helen straightened the folder edges. "I've had years of practice staying calm while other people behaved badly." When she left the office, the November air cut clean and cool against her face. Across the parking lot, Tessa walked beside her, clutching a to-go cup from the lobby's coffee machine. "You feel lighter?" Helen exhaled. "Safer." "Good. Because I brought muffins. Safety tastes better with carbs." They laughed softly, and for the first time in months, Helen felt something loosen, like the first deep breath after a long, shallow one. At a stoplight on her drive home, Helen's phone vibrated with a notification. Joint card, new purchase, 2,180 salons, Nordstrom Easton Town Center. Her lips tightened. The timestamp matched the hour she'd been signing her trust papers. Carla never missed an opportunity to celebrate herself. In the rearview mirror, Helen caught her reflection: silver hair, unflinching eyes, a faint pink line still fading on her cheek. She didn't feel humiliated anymore. She felt focused. She pulled into the driveway, where Bentley's barking echoed faintly from inside. Through the front window, Carla stood in the kitchen, holding a new designer bag, navy leather with gold hardware, turning it toward the light like a trophy. Mark leaned on the counter, saying nothing, hands in his pockets, the way he always did when silence was easier than conscience. Helen parked but didn't step out. She just watched. Inside the car, the folder from Ray's office rested on the passenger seat, crisp and heavy. Her protection, bound in legal weight. She placed a hand over it and smiled faintly. "You enjoy your bag, dear," she murmured. "I've got something better." The afternoon sunlight cut across the living room in pale stripes when Helen zipped her suitcase shut. The sound was small but final, a clean seam closing on months of quiet humiliation. On the dresser sat her black notebook, the one that had become her second heartbeat. She slid it into the outer pocket beside her reading glasses. Downstairs, Bentley's bark broke into a rhythm, short, excited bursts. Through the open window, she heard Carla's voice, bright, brittle laughter echoing from the driveway. "He looks perfect, doesn't he?" she said to her friend. "They put a silk bow on him. Cutest thing in Ohio." Helen glanced at the mirror one last time. Her reflection looked almost serene. Gray hair combed, cream sweater neat, suitcase standing like punctuation beside her. For the first time in weeks, she didn't feel like she was sneaking away from something. She felt like she was walking toward air. On the kitchen counter, she placed a folded note. Her handwriting was as even as ever, the words deliberate. "I'll be staying somewhere that has a seat for me at the table. No anger, no accusation, just the truth in clean lines of ink." Carla's laughter floated closer as the front door opened. "Bentley, come inside." "Oh." Her voice snagged mid-word as she took in the half-empty hallway, the coat missing from the rack, the shoes gone, the silence that stretched too long. "Helen?" she called, her tone rising an octave. Bentley wagged once and trotted to the note, sniffing it as Carla picked it up. Her friend lingered awkwardly at the threshold. "Everything okay?" Carla's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Of course." She just must have gone for a walk. But her hand trembled slightly around the paper. When she realized Helen's overnight bag and purse were missing too, the mask cracked. She snatched her phone, dialing. "Mark, you need to come home. Now." From her car 2 streets away, Helen sat with the engine idling, watching through the gap in the maple trees. She didn't need to see Carla's face to imagine it. Shock, then disbelief, then anger that anyone would dare move without her permission. Her phone buzzed with an incoming text from Mark. "Where are you?" Carla's worried sick. Helen stared at the message for a moment, then turned the screen face down on the passenger seat. Some silences, she'd learned, carried more power than any answer. The drive to Dublin was quiet, the hum of the tires steady as breath. She passed the familiar landmarks: Riverside Hospital, the library, the stretch of road where she used to walk her husband's golden retriever years ago. The memory brushed her lightly, but didn't linger. The senior apartment complex sat tucked behind a grove of maples, red leaves gathering in crisp drifts along the path. The building wasn't luxurious, but it was bright and clean. The receptionist, a young man with kind eyes, handed her the keys and said, "Welcome home, Mrs. Ford." The phrase caught her off guard. Home. It had been a long time since the word felt like anything other than a place she tiptoed through. Inside, the one-bedroom apartment was simple. Soft gray walls, sunlight spilling through wide windows. She placed her suitcase by the door, opened it, and began arranging her few essentials: the notebook, the trust folder, a framed photo of her late husband in his Navy uniform. The quiet felt honest. She sat on the couch, exhaling deeply, the kind of breath that empties years of tightness. For the first time, she could hear her own pulse without Carla's voice layered over it. Her phone buzzed again. She almost ignored it, until she saw the name. Ray Maddox. She answered. "Ray, I was just about to email you. Everything's settled. The move went fine." There was a pause on the other end. Then his tone shifted, no longer the calm precision of a lawyer, but the sharp edge of concern. "Helen, I'm glad you called. You need to hear this before it blindsides you." She straightened. "What's wrong?" "They've filed for emergency guardianship over you," he said. "This morning." For a moment, Helen didn't breathe. The words dropped heavy, rearranging the air. Guardianship. Over her. Ray continued, voice steady but tight. "They're claiming diminished capacity. If this goes through, you lose control of your finances, your trust, everything." Helen closed her eyes. Through the window, the wind lifted the red leaves into a slow swirl, catching sunlight like embers. "Let them try," she said quietly. Her hand rested on the folder beside her, solid and real. "They'll find out soon enough what they can't hold on a leash." The summons came folded into a thick manila envelope, stamped Urgent Probate Division. Helen opened it at her kitchen table, the afternoon sun spilling across the papers like a spotlight. Each paragraph was a distortion of her life: memory lapses, confused financial decisions, possible cognitive decline. It read like fiction written by someone who'd only half paid attention to her but wanted her silenced anyway. By the time she reached the third page, she'd stopped reading. "They're not even good liars," she muttered, pushing her glasses higher on her nose. Ray was already on the phone. "They're claiming you've been forgetting where you live," he said. "That you gave money to strangers. That you accused your daughter-in-law of theft." Helen snorted softly. "I did accuse her of theft. Of my dignity." That earned a laugh from him, short and sharp. "Still, we'll handle this the right way. I've already scheduled a psychological evaluation. State certified. Impartial. They'll regret opening this door." The evaluation was held in a sterile office with taupe walls and soft music that didn't quite disguise the hum of anxiety. The psychologist, Dr. Ellman, was young but composed. "We're just going to have a conversation," she said. Helen nodded, sitting straight, notebook resting on her lap. "I'm good at those." They began with memory tests, problem-solving, and storytelling prompts. Helen named all 50 states in alphabetical order, recited her banking schedule from memory, and corrected a typo on the test sheet halfway through. Dr. Ellman tried not to smile but failed by the end. After 2 hours, Helen stood, shook her hand, and said, "If you ever need help proofing your intake forms, you know who to call." When the results came in, Ray called her personally. "You didn't just pass," he said. "You scored in the 99th percentile for executive function." Helen chuckled. "That should make Carla furious." "It will," Ray said. "And we'll be in court tomorrow morning to hand this to the judge." The Franklin County Courthouse buzzed with the low drone of motion and murmurs. Helen sat beside Ray in a charcoal blazer and pearl earrings, the kind of calm armor that didn't announce itself but was impossible to ignore. Carla and Mark sat across the aisle. Carla wore a cream suit and a smirk. Mark looked like he hadn't slept. When the case was called, the judge leafed through the folder Ray handed her. She skimmed, brow furrowing. Then she looked directly at Carla. "You claimed Mrs. Ford was incapable of managing her affairs." Carla crossed one leg over the other, her voice honeyed. "She's 70, Your Honor. She forgets things, repeats herself. We were only trying to protect her assets. Helen didn't move. Her pulse was steady, her eyes fixed on the judge, not her accuser. Ray waited for the perfect pause before speaking. Respectfully, Your Honor, Mrs. Ford's capacity test results are on page 3. You'll see she performs well above the average for her age group, and, I'd venture, for most people in this room. A few muffled laughs rippled through the benches. The judge's lips twitched. She closed the file with a soft thud. This petition is manipulative and unsupported. Denied. Carla blinked. Excuse me? Denied, the judge repeated. And I'll be noting your conduct in the record. This borders on elder abuse. Mark's shoulders sagged. Carla's hand shot out, gripping his wrist hard enough to blanch his knuckles. When the hearing adjourned, Helen stood. She didn't look at them as she walked out, but she could hear Carla's hiss through the shuffle of papers. This is your fault. You should have pushed harder. Ray held the door for Helen, smiling under his breath. Congratulations. You just won the quietest war in this courthouse. Outside, the winter air was sharp and bracing. Helen tilted her face toward it, letting the cold bite through her calm exterior, grounding her in the moment. Across the street, Tessa waited by her car, grinning like a conspirator. Verdict, she called. Freedom, Helen said. Tessa whooped loud enough to turn a few heads. Then we're celebrating. I baked something. In her kitchen later that night, the cake sat on the counter, thick chocolate frosting, the shape unmistakable. A gavel, slightly crooked but perfect in spirit. Tessa set down the knife. To justice, she said. Helen smiled. And to the fools who don't read what they file. They clinked glasses of wine as the clock ticked softly. The phone rang before sunrise. Helen was already awake, notebook open, coffee cooling beside her. The number flashed Midwest Heritage Credit Union. Mrs. Ford, the voice said, clipped and professional. This is Angela from Fraud Prevention. We detected an attempted wire transfer this morning, 30,500 hours, from one of your legacy accounts. It was flagged for manual review. Helen's pencil stilled above the page. Legacy account, she repeated softly. That one hasn't been touched in years. Exactly, Angela said. The request came through an online form using a shared household device. The signature didn't match yours. Helen didn't need to ask whose device it was. Lock it down, she said. All of them. Every account in my name. Angela's tone sharpened, respectful now. Already done. You'll receive confirmation in writing within the hour. We'll open a formal fraud investigation and forward everything to your attorney. Helen smiled faintly. You're very efficient, Angela. I've met plenty of women who wish they'd called sooner, the woman replied. You're one of the lucky ones. After the call, Helen sat back and watched the sun crawl over the horizon, catching the frost on the apartment's window pane. She felt no fear, just the quiet satisfaction of catching a thief in the act. Before the theft. At 9, she was in Ray's office again. He looked up from his computer, already aware. Credit union called me too. You're fast. They're faster, Helen said. Carla must have thought the guardianship failure meant she had to escalate. Ray exhaled through his nose, his irritation showing in the tap of his pen. I'll be filing a cease and desist before noon. They so much as breathe near your finances again. We'll have grounds for civil action. Helen watched the printer spool out another set of papers, the legal ink crisp and authoritative. You think they'll stop? Ray's mouth curved into something between a smile and a grimace. No, but they'll have fewer places to hide. That afternoon, Helen stopped by the post office. The winter air bit at her cheeks as she dropped Ray's envelope into the blue metal box, thick with documents and proof, everything papered and traceable. The clang of the lid closing sounded almost musical. By the time she returned to her apartment, her inbox was full. Bank confirmations, legal filings, and one email with the subject line, "I'm sorry," from Mark. She stared at it for a long time without clicking. The preview text showed only the first sentence. I didn't know she went that far. Helen closed her laptop. Some letters didn't need opening. Her phone buzzed almost immediately, Tessa's name lighting the screen. "You won't believe this," her friend said, half laughing, half furious. "Carla texted me. Actual words. You've brainwashed her." Helen almost smiled. Maybe I did. Into thinking clearly. "She picked the wrong paralegal to mess with," Tessa said. "You want me to respond?" Helen took a slow sip of coffee. "No. Let silence do the talking." But Tessa never was good at silence. That evening, Helen saw her Facebook post making quiet waves through the small-town circle of mutuals and coworkers. "You slapped the wrong woman. No tags. No names. Just a sentence sharp enough to draw blood in polite company." The comments came fast. Laughing emojis, cryptic hearts, a few, "You okay, girl?" replies. Helen read them once, then closed the app. She didn't need validation. She had paper. She had proof. She had control. As night settled, she sat by the window with her ledger open. The apartment was still, the city lights distant but steady. She wrote in her tidy cursive, "Accounts secured, attempts intercepted, evidence collected." They keep mistaking silence for surrender. The phone buzzed again, a text from an unknown number. For a heartbeat, she thought it might be Carla. But it wasn't. It was from Ray. "Be ready tomorrow. The judge wants a hearing on the fraud petition. Fast track. Could work in our favor." Helen's pen hovered above the page. The next battle was already waiting. She closed her notebook, the leather cover soft under her palm, and whispered to herself, "Let's make it count." The winter light outside the pet supply store glinted off the glass door as Helen pushed it open. Bells above the frame jingled, a friendly sound that didn't match the knot of anticipation in her chest. The air inside smelled faintly of cedar chips and shampoo, the kind used for dogs with delicate coats. She hadn't come here for Bentley. She'd come for closure, or maybe curiosity. "Mrs. Ford?" The voice was soft but certain. Helen turned. Behind the counter stood a young woman in a red polo shirt and name tag, Jenna Harkins. Helen recognized her faintly from months ago, before everything unraveled. Jenna tucked a strand of brown hair behind her ear. "You probably don't remember me, but you came in last spring. Your daughter-in-law was here too. The, tall one? Perfect hair?" Helen gave a polite nod. "That would be Carla." Jenna's expression flickered with something. Hesitation, then resolve. "There's something I've been meaning to tell you." Helen waited. The hum of the store filled the space between them. Aquarium pumps, quiet chatter from the grooming room. "I didn't want to get involved," Jenna said finally. "But I couldn't stop thinking about it after I saw your name in the paper. That court notice about guardianship." Helen's breath caught. "You saw that?" Jenna nodded. "My aunt works at the courthouse. She told me what it meant, and I remembered that day. You and your daughter-in-law were in here. She slapped you." Helen blinked. "You saw that?" "Not directly," Jenna said, stepping closer. "But the front wall is all mirrors behind the counter. I saw the reflection. She hit you across the face, and you didn't even move." Her voice trembled now. The kind that came from remembering something that should have stayed ordinary but didn't. "I froze. I didn't know what to do. I'm sorry I didn't then." Helen's pulse thudded in her throat, not from shock, but from the quiet astonishment of being seen. "You don't need to apologize," she said softly. "You're doing something now." Jenna bit her lip. "If your lawyer needs a statement, I'll give one. I've still got the date and time from the transaction log. It'll match her card purchase." Helen looked at her. This young woman with tired eyes and steady courage, and felt something lift inside her chest. You have no idea how much that matters. I think I do, Jenna said. She humiliated you. People like that think no one's watching. By the time Helen left, the cold had sharpened into sleet. She clutched the signed statement Jenna had typed, neat and official, on store letterhead. A small piece of paper, but it felt heavier than any gavel. That evening, Ray's reaction was immediate. A corroborated eyewitness? That's gold. He laid the document flat on his desk, aligning the corners perfectly. I'll add it to the record. Every one of these threads makes their web smaller. Helen nodded, quiet satisfaction moving through her like heat. I'll keep a copy for myself. Back in her apartment, she opened her estate folder, the thick binder labeled just in case. Inside were her trust papers, will drafts, medical directives, and now Jenna's statement. She slid the page into a plastic sleeve, fingers pressing it flat. The sound of rain against the window filled the room, rhythmic and steady. She closed the binder and traced the label with her thumb, just in case. Once it had meant fear, now it meant preparedness. Her phone buzzed. A social media notification, one she shouldn't have checked but did anyway. Carla had posted again, a glossy photo of Bentley on a velvet couch, tongue out, wearing a Christmas bandana. The caption read, "He's the only one who matters." Helen stared at it for a long time. For months, she'd kept one picture of Bentley on her phone, a silly one from when he was a puppy, paws too big for his frame, eyes trusting. She'd told herself it was a memory worth keeping, separate from the cruelty that came later. But as she looked at Carla's caption, something in her settled with finality. She opened her gallery, found the photo, and held her finger on it until the little trash icon appeared. Delete photo? She pressed yes. The screen went dark, her reflection faint in the glass. She smiled, not a bitter smile, but a clean one, the kind that comes when a wound finally closes. The courthouse smelled faintly of wet wool and old coffee. Rain clung to the coats of the people filing through security, umbrellas dripping onto the tile. Helen moved slowly but purposefully, her posture straight, the trust folder tucked neatly under one arm like a shield. Tessa walked beside her, muttering about the metal detectors. "Whole city knows this is a circus," Tessa said. "They should be charging admission." Helen allowed herself the smallest smile. Let's hope the performance is short. Inside the courtroom, the air hummed with quiet tension. Carla sat at the petitioner's table in a cream suit and pearls, every inch of her styled into control. Mark sat beside her, pale and silent, eyes fixed on the floor. Across the aisle, Ray adjusted his tie and opened a thick binder labeled Ford v. Ford. The judge entered, a woman with sharp eyes and no patience for theatrics. "Proceed." Ray stood. "Your Honor, we intend to demonstrate a clear pattern of financial interference, manipulation, and false reporting designed to seize control of Mrs. Ford's estate." Carla gave a practiced laugh, the kind that pretends to find the accusation absurd. "This is ridiculous," she whispered loudly enough for those in the first row to hear. Ray ignored her. He began his presentation, methodical, deliberate, surgical. First came the timeline, account alerts, transaction attempts, the guardianship filing. Then the receipts. Nordstrom. Luxury purchases made on Mark's joint card within hours of legal meetings. Every sheet landed with the quiet weight of truth. Finally, Ray turned to the witness statement. "And then, Your Honor, we have corroboration of physical and emotional abuse. A third-party witness, Ms. Jenna Harkins, whose testimony is entered as Exhibit D." The judge flipped through the folder, brow tightening. "A slap?" she said flatly. Ray nodded. Documented, corroborated, and paired with subsequent coercive threats. We're prepared to present the evidence under oath. Carla shifted in her seat, color draining slightly from her face. That girl works at a pet store, she snapped. She must have misunderstood. The judge cut her off. Ms. Ford, you'll speak when spoken to. Ray continued. The abuse isn't physical alone. It's psychological, financial, sustained. What they didn't realize is that Mrs. Ford spent 40 years as a paralegal. She documented everything. He turned the binder toward the bench. Every tab, every line, neat and dated. The record of a woman underestimated. Helen sat still through it all, hands folded in her lap. She didn't look at Carla, not once. The hum of the ceiling vent, the rustle of papers, the click of Ray's pen, those were her anchors. When it was Carla's turn to speak, her composure fractured in increments. I was trying to help, she began too quickly. She's not well. She's obsessed. She keeps writing things down. Writing, the judge interrupted, is not a symptom of incompetence. It's a record. Something you might have benefited from before bringing false claims into my courtroom. A low murmur rippled through the gallery. Mark's hands tightened in his lap, knuckles white. The judge leaned forward. You are dangerously close to felony elder abuse, Mrs. Ford. I suggest you take that seriously. Carla's mouth opened, then closed. No sound came out. When the gavel struck, it echoed like thunder through the chamber. Petition dismissed. Permanently. Helen rose with quiet dignity. Ray gathered the files, his expression one of controlled triumph. Across the aisle, Carla's face was frozen fury, bright spots of red burning high on her cheeks. Outside the courthouse, the wind had picked up again. The rain had stopped, but puddles mirrored the gray sky. Carla stormed down the steps ahead of them, her heels clacking like gunfire against the concrete. She turned, eyes locking on Helen. This isn't over, she hissed. Helen didn't respond. She simply adjusted the strap of her handbag and looked past her, toward the parking lot where Tessa's car waited. Ray opened his umbrella, voice calm as ever. She's right, you know. Helen glanced at him, amused. Oh? It's not over, he said. It's your move now. She thought of Jenna's statement, the credit union logs, the endless insults hidden behind smiles, and then she thought of paper, how it never flinched, never forgot. Later that afternoon, in the quiet of her apartment, she sat at her dining table with a fresh stack of forms. Ray's note sat on top, restraining order, draft ready for signature. She read it twice, steady and silent. Then she picked up her pen and signed her name. The hearing was scheduled for a gray Thursday morning, the kind that smelled of wet pavement and courthouse coffee. Helen arrived 10 minutes early, her charcoal coat buttoned high, her trust folder tucked neatly under her arm. The same courtroom, the same judge, but this time, Helen wasn't the one under scrutiny. Ray waited by the benches, reading over his notes. You ready? He asked. Helen adjusted her gloves. I was ready 2 months ago. When Carla entered, the air shifted. She was dressed in crimson this time, lipstick, heels, the kind of red that screamed defiance. Mark trailed behind, shoulders slumped, face pale. Carla's expression was pure theater, wide-eyed indignation layered over panic. The judge didn't waste time. We're here to address Mrs. Ford's request for a civil protection order, she began. Counselor Maddox, proceed. Ray stood, his tone clipped and measured. Your Honor, the petitioner seeks protection from ongoing harassment and attempts at financial interference by her daughter-in-law, Mrs. Carla Ford. Documentation is extensive, verified, and, frankly, self-incriminating. He handed the binder over. The judge skimmed through the first few pages, bank alerts, emails, screenshots of texts, a timeline of every manipulation Carla had tried to pass off as concern. Then came the photographs, The bruise from the slap, the statement from Jenna, the cease and desist acknowledgement from the credit union. Every page another nail in the coffin of Carla's narrative. Carla tried to interrupt twice, but each time the judge silenced her with a raised hand. "You'll have your turn." When it finally came, Carla leaned forward, voice trembling just enough to sound rehearsed. "This is a misunderstanding. Helen is confused. She's being manipulated by people with ulterior motives." Her eyes flicked toward Tessa, sitting quietly in the back row, hands folded around a thermos. The judge didn't even look up. "Mrs. Ford, your financial behavior and previous petitions are well documented. You've demonstrated a pattern of harassment toward your mother-in-law. I see no confusion here, only intent." Carla's mouth opened, then closed. Mark stared down at his hands. Ray glanced at Helen, who hadn't said a word. She didn't need to. Every fact spoke for her. When the gavel came down, it was quiet, but final. "This court grants a full restraining order," the judge said. "Mrs. Carla Ford is to remain 300 feet from Mrs. Helen Ford at all times. She is prohibited from accessing any account, asset, or document belonging to the petitioner. Violations will be treated as contempt." Carla's composure cracked audibly, a strangled sound halfway between disbelief and rage. "You can't, she's—" "I can," the judge said sharply. "And I have. You're dismissed." Mark finally looked up. The judge's gaze landed on him next. "Mr. Ford, you are not a named respondent, but be warned. Continued involvement or complacency could subject you to review. Do you understand?" He nodded once, barely audible. "Yes, Your Honor." The session adjourned. Chairs scraped, papers shuffled. Carla stood frozen, red heels planted like weapons, eyes glassy with fury. Ray closed his binder, turned to Helen. "It's done." Helen exhaled slowly, the sound like air escaping a sealed room. "No," she said softly. "It's beginning." Outside, the cold hit them like a clean blade. Carla's voice sliced through the parking lot before Helen even reached the steps. "You think this makes you safe?" she shouted, her voice echoing off the courthouse glass. "You're nothing without Mark." Helen didn't turn. Her stride was calm, her expression unreadable. Mark stood beside Carla, silent, his hands stuffed into his coat pockets. He didn't move to stop her. He didn't move at all. Tessa was waiting by the curb, leaning against her car with 2 cups of coffee. As Helen approached, Carla's voice broke into a scream. High, wordless, furious. The sound followed Helen for a moment, then faded under the wind. Tessa handed her a cup. "That," she said with a grin, "is what paper is for." Helen took a sip, savoring the heat, the bitter taste grounding her. "It's quiet when truth wins," she said. "Quiet," Tessa agreed, "and permanent." They stood for a while, watching the courthouse doors swing closed, the red of Carla's coat flashing once before disappearing inside. Helen looked up at the gray sky, breathing in the cold air. Her hand brushed against the folder tucked under her arm, the embossed seal of the court catching the light. Snow feathered lightly against the window panes of Ray Maddox's office, melting as it landed. Helen sat at the long oak table, her reading glasses perched low, a red pen in hand. The latest draft of her will lay before her, pages neatly aligned, her handwriting in the margins. Small corrections, deliberate as stitches. Ray leaned back in his chair, watching her work with a faint smile. "You'd make a terrifying attorney," he said. "I was a paralegal," Helen replied without looking up. "We did most of the terrifying." She signed another page. "Let's be clear, Ray. No mention of Mark or Carla. Not one word." Ray nodded. "Understood. I've already drafted the clause. It'll prevent them from contesting on grounds of omission." "Good." Helen capped her pen, sitting back. They took enough while pretending it was care. Let them take nothing now that I'm free. He slid the final pages toward her. Once this is notarized, your assets transfer directly to the living trust. Who would you like listed as co-executors? Tessa Kane, she said immediately, and Jenna Harkins. Ray raised an eyebrow. The pet store witness? Helen's lips softened. She's earned it. She saw what others pretended not to. I trust people who act when it's inconvenient. He nodded, making the note. And beneficiaries? Helen's eyes drifted to the window, where the snow fell heavier now, erasing footprints on the courthouse sidewalk below. Half to the Franklin County Women's Shelter, she said. The other half to the New Albany Animal Rescue. Ray smiled. Beautiful choices. They helped strangers when no one else did. That's what family used to mean. When the final signature was in place, Ray sealed the envelope with the firm's stamp. I'll file copies tomorrow. You can keep the original in your estate folder. Already labeled, Helen said, just waiting for the ink to dry. That evening, her apartment was warm, the air thick with the smell of candle wax and cinnamon tea. Helen sat at her small dining table surrounded by tidy stacks of papers, everything sorted, every file cornered with care. On one side sat a worn wooden box filled with her late husband's old collectibles, navy pins, pocket watches, small mementos from ships long decommissioned. She traced a finger along one brass insignia, polished from years of handling. You'd have liked this ending, she murmured. Neat. Final. She packed the box carefully, wrapping each item in brown paper. A note on top read, "To the Columbus Veterans Heritage Program, for those who served and stayed honorable." When the box was sealed with string, she sat back and let herself smile. It wasn't revenge anymore. It was restoration. Her computer chimed. A new email alert blinked across the screen. Online complaint filed, Helen Ford. She clicked. The message was brief. Carla had submitted a public complaint accusing Helen of elder fraud and manipulative influence by outsiders. The tone was desperate, almost rambling. Beneath it, another notification appeared. Content flagged for violation. Post removed. Helen exhaled through her nose, slow and calm. They never learn, she whispered. A minute later, Tessa called. Did you see Carla's meltdown on the internet? It didn't even last 15 minutes. Flagged for defamation. Helen chuckled softly. You sound disappointed. Oh, I am, Tessa said. I was ready with popcorn. Save it, Helen replied. You'll need it for the next storm. Later that night, Helen sat at her writing desk, the same one she'd had for 20 years. The lamp cast a soft circle of light across the paper. She pulled out fine stationery, uncapped a fountain pen, and began a letter addressed in elegant cursive. To Mark. Her hand trembled once, then steadied. My son. There are things a mother never wants to write. This is one of them. I loved you long before Carla ever did, and I will love you long after she's gone. But love doesn't mean blindness. You chose comfort over conscience, silence over truth. You let someone bruise what I built. Not just the money, but the peace that was ours. You'll find no inheritance in my papers, but you will find my handwriting. That's all that's left to give. A record of what happens when a person forgets who taught them right from wrong. Take this as a kindness, not a punishment. You still have time to change. She read the letter twice before folding it neatly and sliding it into an envelope. On the front, she wrote, "To be opened only after my death." Then she placed it inside the estate folder, sealing it shut with a small piece of tape. When she was done, she turned off the lamp, the room falling into the quiet hum of the heater. Outside, the snow had stopped. The world looked clean again. The first morning Helen walked into the Franklin Adult Learning Center, the building smelled faintly of chalk, disinfectant, and coffee that had been brewed too long ago. She paused in the doorway of room 204, taking in the mismatched desks, the scuffed linoleum, and the bulletin board cluttered with handwritten notes of encouragement. It wasn't glamorous, but it was hers, a place where words mattered again. Mrs. Ford? The program director, a kind woman named Patrice, appeared with a clipboard and a smile. We're thrilled to have you. You'll be tutoring the night English group, mostly working adults finishing their GEDs. Helen nodded. Then I'll make sure they finish strong. By the time class began, 6 students had gathered. 3 men in work boots, 2 women with notebooks and nervous smiles, and a young mother named Rachel balancing a toddler on her hip. Helen wrote her name on the whiteboard, her handwriting steady, elegant. I spent 40 years making other people's words sound precise, she told them. Now, let's make yours powerful. That night, as she locked up the classroom, Rachel lingered behind. Mrs. Ford, she said softly, thank you for doing this. I've been saving for tuition for 2 years. It's hard. Helen looked at her, really looked, and saw the exhaustion, the fierce will to keep going. What's your program? She asked. Medical billing. Just need 1 semester left. Helen smiled faintly. How much is 1 semester? Rachel hesitated, embarrassed. A little over 1,000. Why? Helen reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope already addressed to the Franklin Scholarship Fund. Because someone once helped me when I didn't ask, she said. It's your turn now. Rachel's eyes widened, glassy with gratitude. I can't. Yes, Helen interrupted gently. You can. A week later, Tessa hosted her famous dinner, part reunion, part declaration of victory. The long farmhouse table gleamed under strings of amber light, plates of roasted vegetables and cornbread crowding the center. A chalkboard near the entry read, in looping cursive, dinner for women who walked away and won. Laughter filled every corner of the room. Stories of divorces survived, houses reclaimed. Quiet triumphs earned 1 paper at a time. Tessa moved between guests like a general in an apron, brandishing a wine bottle. Helen, she said, sliding into the seat beside her. You're glowing. Helen smirked. That's just good moisturizer. Don't be modest. You've looked 10 years younger since all that paperwork started paying off. Helen lifted her glass. Freedom's good for the skin. They clinked glasses, laughter bubbling between them. The evening stretched warm and bright, a soft hum of resilience wrapped in candlelight. By the time Helen returned home, the apartment felt different. Not empty, just peaceful. She slipped off her shoes, noticing how quiet her footsteps sounded against the polished floor. A stack of mail waited on the counter. At the top, an envelope from Ray Maddox. She opened it carefully, eyes scanning the first line. Final confirmation. Living trust closed. Will registered and active. All assets protected. A handwritten note followed in Ray's familiar scrawl. They can't touch a cent. Or you. Permanently yours, Ray. Helen exhaled slowly, the paper trembling just slightly in her hands. The word permanently lingered, not as fear, but as peace. She placed the letter in her estate folder, the same one that had once been a weapon, now simply a record of survival. Then she brewed a cup of tea, turned on the soft jazz station she liked, and sat by the window. Outside, snow still lined the curbs, but the sky had that faint silver glow that promised spring wasn't far off. Her old chair, worn, uncomfortable, creaked when she sat. She looked around the apartment, at everything that had been rebuilt, reclaimed, redefined. And she decided something quietly. The next morning, she drove to the furniture store on Sawmill Road. She spent nearly an hour testing chairs until she found it. A soft leather recliner, deep brown, built like it could hold the weight of a life rebuilt. When it was delivered that afternoon, Helen sank into it with a sigh that came from somewhere deep. The leather creaked softly, wrapping her in warmth. On the table beside her sat her notebook, its pages filled and closed for the first time in months. Tessa texted her later. "How's retirement 2.0?" Helen smiled and typed back. "Comfortable. Finally." She set her phone down, legs tucked under her, eyes on the window as the afternoon light shifted gold. The knock came just as the sun dipped behind the trees. 3 soft raps. Hesitant. Familiar. Helen froze halfway to the kitchen, the kettle whistling behind her. She turned down the burner, letting the steam fade, and waited. When she opened the door, Mark stood there. His face looked older than she remembered. Drawn, unshaven, eyes rimmed in sleepless red. He was still in his work clothes, the same loose gray jacket he'd worn through the hearings, the fabric now wrinkled and damp from the cold. "Mom," he said quietly, "can I come in?" Helen hesitated for a long moment, then stepped aside. "5 minutes," she said. He nodded, stepping into the small apartment. His eyes darted around the room, the warm light, the leather chair, the smell of chamomile and lemon oil. He looked like a man entering a life that had moved on without him. "You look good," he said. "I am good." They sat at the small kitchen table. The silence stretched between them, long and taut. Mark rubbed his palms together, searching for words. Finally, he exhaled. "Carla's leaving me." Helen didn't flinch. "Is that so?" She's already gone, actually." He laughed once, humorless. Took the car, the savings, what little was left. Said she couldn't handle the embarrassment. The foreclosure notice came yesterday. Helen's fingers paused on her teacup. "Foreclosure?" He nodded, eyes glassy. "They froze her accounts after the court order. She tried to move money out of my name, too. Everything collapsed. The bank's repossessing the house next month." Helen looked down at the steam rising from her cup. It curled upward like a ghost, soft, vanishing. "That house was never hers to keep," she said. Mark's voice cracked. "I know. I should have stopped it all sooner. I was just scared," Helen finished for him. He nodded, tears collecting in the corners of his eyes. "She said if I didn't go along, she'd leave. I thought I could fix it quietly, that you'd understand." He leaned forward, desperate. "I'm sorry, Mom. I really am. I lost everything." Helen studied him. The boy she'd raised, the one who used to bring her wildflowers from the backyard, was still in there somewhere, buried under years of cowardice and compromise. But she also saw the man who had watched her be humiliated and said nothing. She stood, walked to the small file cabinet in the corner, and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was crisp, neatly folded, labeled in her sharp handwriting, "Legal Consequences of Elder Abuse. Summary." When she set it on the table, Mark looked confused. "What is this?" "Information," Helen said. "Something you never cared to read." He scanned it. Definitions, statutes, penalties, real cases. His hands trembled as he reached the final line. "Elder abuse is not just physical. Silence can be participation." Helen's voice was calm, even. "I used to think forgiveness was something you owed family. But forgiveness," she said, her eyes meeting his, "is earned through truth. And truth is a thing you've avoided all your life." He looked up, tears streaking his face. "Please, Mom, I didn't mean—" "You made your choices," she said softly, final as a closing argument. Mark's mouth opened, but no words came. He nodded once, a small broken motion, and stood. At the door, he hesitated. "She's going to lose everything," he whispered. "Maybe that's what she deserves, but it doesn't fix what I did." Helen didn't answer. She turned away, her voice steady but distant. Then fix what you become next. He left quietly, the door clicking shut behind him. The sound lingered, small and sharp in the quiet room. Helen sat back down, her heartbeat steady. She folded the paper again and slipped it back into the file. The kettle on the stove had gone cold, but she poured herself another cup anyway, letting the ritual soothe her. Through the window, snow had begun to fall again, thin flakes drifting across the streetlights, soft as dust. She thought of the house in New Albany, the marble countertops, the gold hardware Carla had loved so much. Empty now, waiting for strangers. Her phone buzzed on the table, a message from Ray. Bank confirmed repossession. Title reverted. They're officially out. Helen stared at the words, then set the phone face down. The victory felt clean, not triumphant. Like a window finally opened in a room that had been closed too long. She stood, walked to the window, and watched the flakes gather on the sill. Somewhere in the city, a foreclosure sign was being hammered into frozen ground. She whispered to the glass, not bitter but certain, paper remembers. The red luxury sedan looked out of place sitting on the curb, gleaming, idling, and waiting for a tow truck. Its front tires were angled toward the street as if ready to flee, but the flashing hazard lights told the truth. It wasn't going anywhere. Across the street, two men in reflective vests tightened chains around its wheels. Carla stood on the porch, shouting into a phone, her voice sharp enough to carry even from a distance. A plastic cup of iced coffee trembled in her hand. She didn't notice the neighbors watching from their windows, or the realtor's car idling just beyond the driveway. By the time the tow truck pulled away, the car's polished reflection had vanished, leaving only tracks in the slush and the sound of Carla's last scream swallowed by the February wind. The house, once all white stone and confidence, stood hollow now. A printed sheet taped to the glass front door flapped against the wind. Bank-owned property, no trespassing, the same words Carla used to wield as pride, ownership, control, status, were now signatures of absence. Mark moved into a shared rental across town, a boxy beige house near the interstate. The living room had secondhand furniture and the constant hum of an overworked furnace. His new roommates were co-workers from the warehouse, men who didn't ask questions and didn't mind if he drank quietly in the evenings. He told them little, except that he was starting over. No one pressed further. They could all see that starting over, for him, didn't mean redemption. It meant surviving the wreckage he'd helped build. Sometimes, after long shifts, he'd scroll through old photos of the house. Before the foreclosure notice, before the red car was hauled away. There was one of Carla laughing in front of the Christmas tree, holding a glass of champagne. It had been Helen's crystal flute. He deleted it one night without realizing why, then sat staring at the empty space it left on his screen. Helen heard about the repossession from Ray first. His voice carried quiet satisfaction. All tied up. House auction scheduled for next week. She only nodded. Then it's done. Still, a week later, she found herself driving past New Albany out of habit. The roads slick with the remains of a thawing winter. The houses grew larger as she turned down the familiar street, facades polished, lawns trimmed even in cold weather. Then there it was, her son's house, stripped of its illusion. The curtains were gone, the porch lights dead. A realtor's lockbox clinked faintly in the wind. Helen parked at the curb, engine running. The for sale sign leaned slightly, its base crusted in melting snow. She stayed behind the wheel, hands folded on the steering wheel, breathing slow and steady. Through the windshield she could see Bentley, the golden retriever, standing near the front door. Someone must have let him out. He sniffed the air, tail low, pacing the edge of the driveway. For a second, the dog lifted his head, as if he sensed her. Helen's hand tightened around the gearshift. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered. A woman in a gray coat stepped onto the porch, a shelter worker, clipboard in hand. She coaxed Bentley gently with a treat, clipped a leash to his collar, and led him toward the van parked at the curb. Its side door bore a familiar logo, New Albany Animal Rescue. Helen let out a quiet laugh that wasn't quite humor. The same shelter her will now funded. The same one that would feed and house him. Life, it seemed, had a sense of symmetry. She waited until the van pulled away, Bentley's tail visible through the rear window before starting her car again. The road stretched out empty before her, the horizon washed pale with morning light. That evening, Helen stopped by the shelter. She didn't mention who she was. She didn't need to. The young clerk recognized her name from the donation ledger and smiled. "We just took in a retriever today," she said. "Sweet boy, bit confused but gentle as they come." Helen glanced through the viewing window. Bentley was curled in a blanket, eyes half closed, his golden fur warm under the fluorescent lights. "He'll be fine," Helen said quietly. "He's good at landing on his feet." Before leaving, she filled out a small form at the counter, an anonymous donation slip. $20,000, earmarked for animal rehabilitation and foster outreach. The pen hovered a moment before she signed her initials, precise and small. Then she slid the envelope across the counter. Outside, the night was cool and still. Helen stood under the parking lot lights, breathing in the faint scent of rain. Her reflection looked calm in the car window. Older, yes, but whole. She opened the driver's side door and paused, glancing once toward the shelter. Through the glass, she could just make out Bentley lying down again, head on his paws. Safe. "Good night, boy," she whispered, almost smiling. The rain began in slow, deliberate strokes, soft enough to sound like static against the windows, steady enough to fill the silence with rhythm. Helen stood in her kitchen, arranging 2 plates on the table she'd bought secondhand the week she moved to Dublin. The surface was worn smooth from years of use, but tonight it looked warm under candlelight. 2 place settings, simple linen napkins, a bottle of red breathing beside the bread. Tessa's laughter floated from the doorway before the knock even came. "Smells like you've been showing off again." Helen smiled as she opened the door. "Only a little. Roast chicken, green beans, and pie from your favorite bakery. I figured we deserved something home-cooked and something store-bought. Balance." Tessa stepped inside, shaking the rain from her scarf, her boots squeaking softly on the tile. "You mean justice and joy?" she said, setting down a small bouquet of lilies. "You've had your share of the first. It's time for more of the second." Helen placed the flowers in a glass jar. "Then tonight, no talk of courts, lawyers, or ghosts." "Deal." They ate slowly, conversation flowing the way it once had in their younger days. Easy, looping, alive. They laughed over old office stories, over men who'd mistaken kindness for weakness, over the absurdity of how long it takes to rebuild peace. At one point, Tessa raised her glass. "To women who refuse to vanish." Helen clinked hers gently against it. "To women who document." The wine was rich, earthy. It filled the room with warmth, the kind that makes everything sound softer. Outside, the rain thickened, tracing silver threads down the window. When the plates were empty and the candles burned low, Tessa reached for her coat. "You sure you're okay alone tonight?" Helen smiled. "Alone isn't the same as lonely." Tessa studied her a moment, then nodded. "You're right. You've built yourself a fortress of paper and peace. I'll see you Sunday." After the door closed, the apartment fell back into quiet, a different kind of silence than before. Not heavy, not hollow, just still. Helen walked to the mantel above the fireplace. A single card sat propped between framed photographs, One of her and her late husband, another of her and Tessa at the courthouse steps, grinning like thieves who'd stolen justice. The card was from Jenna, handwritten in looping blue ink. "You changed my life. Thank you for letting me be brave too." Helen brushed her thumb over the words, her chest tightening with something both tender and fierce. On the coffee table, her estate folder waited. The final copy of her will, sealed, notarized, complete, rested atop it. She carried it to the small safe tucked behind the bookshelf, pressed her finger to the keypad, and listened to the lock click open. Inside were the pieces of her legacy: documents, letters, the black notebook that had started it all. She placed the folder in the center, closed the door, and turned the dial until the soft thunk echoed in the quiet. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about balance. The scales finally even. Helen turned off the kitchen light and crossed the room to her new leather chair. The deep brown surface gleamed under the dim glow of the lamp. She sank into it, the leather sighing around her, her legs tucked neatly under her like a child settling into bed. Outside, the rain softened to a hush, the sound of it like fingers tracing memory against glass. On the table beside her sat her tea, still warm, faintly sweet. Helen lifted it, savoring the steam. Across the room, the candle flickered once before steadying, its flame reflected in the glass of the framed photo beside it. She thought of everything that had brought her here: the steak, the slap, the silence. The paper trail that built its own kind of justice. Each moment had been a piece of the same design. Now, at last, it was quiet. She leaned back, eyes half closed, the rain whispering its final punctuation against the window. A slow, satisfied smile curved her lips as she murmured, more to herself than anyone else: "She fed the dog first, so I fed the paperwork," and walked away full.